In today's flip lecture, we're going to talk about the Second Continental Congress and their decision to declare independence for the United States of America. And the Second Continental Congress is called together because the crisis that had erupted after the First Continental Congress had not been resolved. And so the colonial leaders once again get together to figure out what they're going to do. And the Second Continental Congress is based in Philadelphia. The building you see is Independence Hall, where they met. And at the start of this, most delegates from these colonies, they really don't want independence. All they want is to stay a part of the British Empire, but also to retain their right to self-rule. In fact, they so wanted to avoid war that the Second Continental Congress drafted a document called the Olive Branch Petition that was sent to the King of England asking for peace after the events of Lexington Concord and the war that had started. The first thing they stated was that the colonies were still loyal to the king. So they're not really trying to antagonize, and they're not declaring independence yet. And they actually asked for a ceasefire, an end to the war, until the situation could be figured out by talking diplomatically. But the King of England, George III, refused to even open it, because the Continental Army had been fighting and they had invaded Canada and attacked Quebec. And upon receival of the Olive Branch Petition, George III declared the colonies were an open rebellion and they were avowed enemies. So as kind of coming back under British rule becomes more unlikely, the Second Continental Congress actually begins taking upon itself to act as an independent government governing the colonies. But even though they're starting to act more independently, many of these delegates were still unwilling to declare independence from Great Britain. So something's going to have to change in order for these delegates to decide that America should be an independent country. A lot of these people aren't radicals. They still hope to kind of reconcile things peacefully. But public opinion is going to begin to change, and it's going to influence Congress's decisions. And the thing that has the most impact on changing public opinion is a pamphlet written by a guy called Thomas Paine. He called this pamphlet Common Sense, and it was widely printed and distributed all over the colonies. And in Common Sense, he doesn't write in any sort of a style that uses a lot of big words. He writes in a style ordinary folk can understand, like a sermon, a homily. And the arguments that he puts out are basically supposed to be common sense arguments for why the United States should not be a part of Great Britain. His arguments for that a small island shouldn't rule a continent. Kind of size matters. He says that America is not a British nation because it's made up of people from all over Europe. He also says that Britain is always going to drag the colonies into wars and basically be able to prevent their free trade. He also says that Britain is way too far away to rule America. That simply communication just takes too long, so the colonies should govern themselves. And then finally he says that Britain is going to govern the colonies for the benefit of Great Britain, not for the benefits of the colonies themselves. So Paine's arguments are pretty common sense arguments, and they have a big impact on the way that people are thinking. It's going to bring more ordinary people, average colonists, into this political discussion, even those who were illiterate, because people would literally just stand on a street corner and read from Common Sense. So even if you couldn't read, you could still listen to somebody read it and understand the ideas. He also does something else that is brilliant. He shifts the blame for all of the injustices from the British Parliament and the British people squarely onto the British king. That it is much easier to target an individual. And so he focuses on the idea that monarchs are tyrants, that kings always take away power from the people, a very effective argument to the colonists during this time. And George Washington himself said that common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of men, acknowledging that opinion is starting to shift in the country. So now that the people are going to be ready, and many are going to favor independence, Congress is going to start debating this decision. And so this seems kind of crazy, though, declaring independence, having to defeat one of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful countries. So why do these colonies become more bold? And the reasons for independence are a few. The first is that there are early military successes. The colonies had actually won a couple of battles against the British Empire, and they believed that independence could be won. Also, the British refusal to read the olive branch petition kind of made it seem to the colonies that peaceful resolution was not going to be found. Also, public opinion in general had swung in favor of a movement towards independence. So, with this thought in mind, the Continental Congress begins debating independence, and the person who submits the resolution for independence is a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee. And yes, he is a relative of Robert E. Lee, who would later fight in the Civil War. And before they vote on independence, they make a couple of contingencies, a couple of conditions. The first is that the vote must be unanimous. All the colonies must vote to declare independence. And the second is that they want to write a Declaration of Independence to spell out, both for the American people and for Europe, who remember they're trying to get as allies, the reasons for their independence. And the people chosen to write it: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Ben Franklin, and Robert Livingston, all considered some of the top minds in the United States at the time. And so this committee met in order to basically write several drafts of this declaration. And once the Declaration was written, Congress is actually going to make a lot of changes to the first draft, including a major one that removes a passage that actually dealt with slavery. There was a passage called the Slavery Clause that said that basically a grievance against the king was that they allowed for slavery to be a part of the United States. This was very hotly debated by the members of the colonies, especially those who relied on slavery for their economy, especially kind of southern planters. And so the slavery clause gets cut from the Declaration of Independence. And a very interesting kind of idea is to think about what would have happened if the Declaration of Independence had actually kept this condemnation of slavery as an institution. But eventually, they vote in favor of adopting the Declaration of Independence and the Resolution for Independence. And so, the members of the Continental Congress all sign the Declaration, declaring the United States a free and independent country from Great Britain. And this is that document. As you can see, John Hancock signed his name first and signed it extremely large. There's a lot of myths surrounding this, but one of the most popular ones is that he said he wanted it to be big enough so that the king could read it without having to put on his glasses. But again, that's myth. We don't actually know the truth, but it's a nice story. So on July 4th of 1776, the Second Continental Congress officially adopted the Resolution for Independence, creating a new country called the United States of America. So the cause of the war has now shifted. Before it was about self-defense. Now it is a war for independence. And furthermore, this document is going to set down the ideals that the new country is going to be founded on. That is, if they can win the war. And so the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are the ideas that become the United States. The idea that all men are created equal, that we all have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, the idea of the social contract in the United States, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of protecting those rights, those liberties, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The idea that we should change our government if it does not serve us. And then finally, the idea that this government should be founded on principles and organize its power in such a way that will most likely provide for the safety and happiness of the American people. So all the ideas that become the United States are contained within this document. And after this, Ben Franklin remarked that as a Continental Congress, that we must indeed all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. In the Declaration, the members of the Congress pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, all of which would be at risk for the remainder of the war. The members of this Continental Congress, along with all who took up arms against Britain, were committing all-out treason. And they all chose to do this, just like Nathan Hale before them, knowing full well the potential consequences, the fact that they could all lose everything they had, and that they could even be hung for their role in independence. So in the colonies, copies are spread all over, and they're read in the very streets of all the major towns and cities. So George Washington reads it to his entire army, and it inspires the new Americans, and it gives them a reason to fight and something to fight for throughout the remainder of the war. And so the United States of America has been established. And at the end of the war, the United States is going to look back to that Declaration of Independence for guidance in deciding what kind of nation the United States would be and what principles the country would stand for.